Michael was 5 years old when something extraordinary happened in a church in the state of Ohio. What came out of this boy's mouth that Sunday morning made 180 people stop breathing. This is the miracle that changed a family forever. Margaret had been raising her grandson Michael since he was a baby. Michael's parents died in a car accident when the boy was only 8 months old. Margaret, a widow and already retired, took on the responsibility of raising her grandson. Before we continue, write here in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It is moving to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. At the age of 2, Michael was diagnosed with a profound case of autism. He had never spoken a single word. The months went by, and Michael remained in complete silence. Margaret's life revolved entirely around Michael. Twice a week, she took him to the speech therapist. 3 times a week to occupational therapy. Once a month, an appointment with a neurologist, Dr. Martinez. Waiting rooms became part of her daily life. The smell of alcohol in the clinics. The constant sound of children crying or calling for their parents. It was a tiring routine marked by long hours of waiting and silent car rides. Even so, Margaret never complained. On the contrary, with each appointment, she carried with her a quiet hope that maybe that day something different would happen with Michael. Michael attended a specialized school. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, always commented that Michael was different from the other children. He has something special in his eyes, she would say. At home, Michael had very specific routines. He woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning. He always had breakfast in the same chair, using the same green cup. He only played with 3 toys, a blue little truck, which he slowly pushed in a straight line across the floor, puzzle pieces, which he did not use to complete pictures, but to create perfect rows, knocking them down forcefully if anyone dared move a piece, and a worn-out gray elephant he had received on his first birthday. He held the elephant tightly, pressing it against his chest as if it were his anchor. Any attempt to change the order of these toys made him restless, but when he managed to line everything up just the way he wanted, a rare and delicate smile would appear on his face. These small gestures were what lit up Margaret's heart. Michael never showed interest in children's TV programs. He did not react to music. He was not drawn to colorful books. The only exception was on Sundays. Michael became visibly calmer on Sundays, and when Margaret said, "Let's go to church," he would immediately walk to the door. In church, Michael behaved in a unique way. He walked straight to the 4th pew on the left side and fixed his gaze on the statue of the Virgin Mary. Throughout the entire Mass, he remained in that position. Margaret noticed that Michael moved his lips during Mass as if he were whispering. He would pause, move his lips again, pause as if he were speaking to someone. During the first few months, Margaret thought it was just normal behavior. But after some months, Margaret realized that Michael only showed this lip movement in 2 specific places. At church, looking at the Virgin Mary, and at home by the bedroom window at night. Every night, before going to sleep, Michael would get up and go to the window. The glass fogged slightly with the cold of the night, and a breeze slipped through the thin curtain, making it sway gently. He stood still, gazing at the sky as if searching for something beyond the stars. Slowly, he brought his hands together, took a deep breath, and moved his lips silently for long minutes. The silence of the room was broken only by the distant sound of crickets outside. Then, with the same calm, he returned to bed and covered himself as if he had fulfilled a sacred ritual. One night, Margaret approached while Michael was at the window. "Are you talking to someone?" she whispered. Michael turned, looked directly at her, something rare, and nodded. "With whom?" Margaret pressed. Michael pointed toward the sky, then placed his hand on his chest. Margaret was intrigued. Perhaps Michael was referring to his parents, who had passed away. But how could a child who had never met his parents be referring to them? She decided not to push further and simply observe. Margaret spoke with Dr. Martinez about what she had been observing. It is common for autistic children to develop specific rituals for certain environments. He explained this can help them feel safe. But there's something different. Margaret insisted. Michael only does these lip movements in church and at the window at home, nowhere else. At school, Mrs. Rodriguez also began noticing subtle changes. Michael has been more present during activities. Yesterday, he drew something that looked like a human figure for the first time. Margaret asked to see the drawing. It was simple, but it showed a female figure with something covering her head. At home, Margaret kept observing Michael's patterns. The nightly visits to the window were absolutely consistent. They lasted between 5 and 10 minutes regardless of weather or temperature. Michael did this every night without exception. Over the following weeks, Michael began responding to simple questions with clearer gestures. When Margaret asked if he wanted water, he nodded yes or no. Small steps, but definite ones. Dr. Martinez grew interested in Margaret's reports. Michael is showing improvement in communication. Keep encouraging these interactions. Margaret noticed that Michael responded better when he was calm. The best moments were after his visits to the window and before going to church on Sundays. Whenever she mentioned church, Michael became more attentive. On a Wednesday afternoon, Michael took Margaret's hand and led her to the closet where the Sunday clothes were kept. Margaret understood. He wanted to go to church. Michael, today is not Sunday. The church is closed. Michael seemed to understand, but he was clearly disappointed. Margaret noticed that Michael had developed his own language through gestures and expressions. It wasn't just nodding yes or no. He used varied facial expressions and even guided Margaret through the house when he wanted something specific. During occupational therapy sessions, the therapist Elena commented that Michael seemed more coordinated. He is following simple instructions better than before. There is a general improvement in his body awareness. Margaret began to realize that the changes in Michael were happening gradually, but consistently. He was more present in the world, more connected with the people around him, especially with her. During Mass, Michael's lip movements became more elaborate. Margaret noticed that he paused as if he were listening to something, then resumed as if he were answering. The pattern definitely seemed like a conversation. On Sunday, Margaret woke up to a strange noise at 5:30 in the morning. There were footsteps in the hallway. Firm, determined steps, completely different from Michael's usual movements. When she went down to the kitchen, she found a scene that left her speechless. Michael was fully dressed in his Sunday clothes, the light blue shirt she always had to help him button, the dress pants he normally refused to wear, the black shoes that usually caused tantrums. Everything was flawless, as if an invisible force had dressed him with perfection. But that was not all. Michael was standing beside the kitchen table with an upright, almost solemn posture. His hands were folded in front of his body, and his eyes, normally vague and distant, had a focus Margaret had never witnessed before. "Michael, how did you dress yourself?" Margaret asked, still processing the scene. Michael looked directly at her, a prolonged, intense gaze, and then pointed at the clock on the wall. Margaret prepared the usual breakfast: toast with jam, warm milk in a green cup, a banana sliced into perfectly equal rounds. But Michael did something unthinkable. He shook his head in a clear, definite no. In 5 years, he had never once refused his eating routine. "Michael, you need to eat," Margaret insisted. But he got up from a chair, took Margaret's purse from the sideboard in the entrance, then went to the hook where the car keys hung. He picked them up and walked to the door. "Michael, it's only 6:30 in the morning. Mass doesn't start until 9. Michael remained motionless at the door, waiting with the patience of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Watching her grandson's inexplicable behavior, Margaret made a decision she would later consider the most important of her life. "All right, Michael, let's go." When they arrived at the church at 7 o'clock, the parking lot was completely empty. Margaret parked in the usual spot and waited for Michael to get out of the car, but he remained still in the back seat. He was staring at the church with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Michael, we've arrived," Margaret said, but he did not move. He kept observing the church for a full 3 minutes, as if he were evaluating something only he could see. Then, suddenly, he opened the door and stepped out with precise movements. Frank, the caretaker, was sweeping the entrance steps when he saw them approaching. "Margaret, you came quite early today. Is everything all right?" But before she could respond, Frank stopped sweeping and fixed his eyes on Michael. "That boy is different today. There is something in his eyes." Margaret looked at Michael and felt the same. There was a seriousness in his expression, a maturity that did not match a 5-year-old child. "Please make yourselves comfortable," Frank continued, still watching Michael with curiosity. "I'll finish preparing the altar." Michael went straight to his pew, but he did not sit down immediately. He remained standing, looking around as if orienting himself. Then he positioned himself differently, straighter, more upright. For 2 hours from 7 to 9, Michael maintained a concentration Margaret had never witnessed before. His lips moved intensely. It was not involuntary movement. Margaret observed changes in Michael's expression during those 2 hours. He smiled several times. He nodded as if agreeing. There were moments when he seemed to be asking questions, and others when he appeared to be receiving instructions. At 8:30, the congregation began to arrive. Families entered. Children played in the aisles. The usual Sunday murmur. Michael finally sat down, but he kept his full focus on the statue of the Virgin Mary. Father Antonio began the Mass. During hymns and readings, Michael remained in absolute concentration, and it was precisely at 9:43, while Father Antonio was speaking about the importance of faith, that Margaret noticed a change in her grandson's behavior. Michael slowly rose from the pew. Margaret thought Michael was going to the bathroom, but he headed toward the altar. The entire congregation noticed immediately a 5-year-old boy who had never spoken walking alone during Mass. Father Antonio stopped in the middle of the homily. Silence spread throughout the church. 180 people turned their eyes to Michael, who walked with steady steps down the central aisle. Michael stopped directly in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary. The morning light created a special atmosphere around the image. He looked up, put his hands together, and the impossible happened. For the first time in 5 years, Michael opened his mouth. His voice echoed clearly through the church, filled with innocence and purity. The sound was distinct, firm, without hesitation, as if that word had been kept inside him all this time, waiting only for the right moment to be born. Before anyone could react, Michael raised his hands and continued, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." Each sentence came out perfect, without hesitation, as if he were being guided. It was impossible to imagine how a child who had never uttered words could recite with such clarity and devotion. The silence in the church was absolute. The only sound was Michael's voice echoing through the walls and rising like a hymn to heaven. Margaret, overcome with tears, pressed her hands against her chest. For her, there was no doubt something supernatural was happening before her eyes. Michael completed the entire prayer. "For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever." When he finished, he remained in silence, looking upward. His lips were still moving without sound, as if he were hearing a response that no one else could hear. For a few seconds, the silence was so profound that even the sound of the burning candles seemed too loud. Then, with serenity, he walked back to the pew and sat down. Margaret embraced him tightly, her heart racing. "Grandma," the beautiful lady said, "that I can speak now."